So, and John, this is for you. This is for you. 85% of the time, you're not going to have a buzz in your headphones, but sometimes you will.
We're about 3 minutes away from starting, so I just wanted to welcome you to the evening and to let you know that this is the latest in our series of debates in which we were hoping and intending to intersect with the presidential campaign and the topics that came up in the course of that conversation, and I think that we've succeeded with this choice on discussing gerrymandering and the potential impact on the political center. My name is John Donvan. I just want to take a personal moment. I don't know if you have heard the sad news that Gwen Ifill, the anchor of the PBS NewsHour, passed away today. She was a friend, and in so many ways, her work, her ethic, her style, her demeanor stood for and captured what we also aim for here, which is to raise the level of public discourse. In that regard, Gwen Ifill was a champion, and I would like to dedicate this debate to her and hope that we continue to live up to her spirit. In the course of this debate, we rely very much on you as members of the audience in a couple of different ways. One is that we ask you to vote on the motion, and your vote helps to decide the winner or loser of the debate. It is actually a debate, and it's a competitive debate, and it's an Oxford-style debate, which means it's about this resolution, this proposition before us. Gerrymandering is destroying the political center. The way that you vote when the time comes, if you go to that keypad at your seat, you'll see there's a bunch of buttons on it. If you only pay attention to buttons 1, 2, and 3, that's all you need to know. Button 1 will mean that you agree with the motion. You're voting yes. Number 2 means that you disagree with the motion, and number 3 means that you're undecided. And the voting takes place very quickly, and we can tabulate the results quite quickly. The other way in which you have a key part to play in the debate is that in the middle portion of the evening, it becomes more free form. In the Oxford style, we have set timed rounds and rebuttal rounds, but this is a free form middle section. In that case, I ask questions of the debaters and they can ask questions of one another, but I also come to you and I ask you to put questions to them as well. I'm pretty strict about what I'll allow as a question, but I think everybody can work within it. The rule is that the question really needs to be a question. I want to discourage you from debating with the debaters, but actually to put a question before them that gets them to debate with each other at an even better level. I'm fine if you state a very, very brief premise, but I don't want you to be building a case for your question. Just put the question. It usually works very, very well. And if in my judgment, the question is not actually going to move forward debate on our specific motion, and I want to be clear, tonight our motion is not gerrymandering is bad. Our motion is not a dispute over whether there is polarization. Our motion assumes there is fully. So that's how it will work. And I hope that everybody enjoys and votes appropriately. We always begin these debates by bringing the people who make them happen to the stage, and in this case, we're partnering with the National Constitution Center of Philadelphia, which is led by Jeffrey Rosen, and as always, hi Bob, how are you? So Bob, this partnership that we have ongoing with the National Constitution Center links debate with constitutional issues effectively, and how?
Yes, we are so thrilled by our partnership. I'm so delighted to welcome everyone to GW. I'm a law professor here, and I'm also the head of the wonderful National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, the only place in America that has a debate and to bring all sides together to unite around the Constitution. One of the most exciting partnerships we have is our partnership with Intelligence Squared. And we've started, thanks to Bob's vision, this great series of constitutional debates. So usually we say to the audience, don't vote your policy views, vote your constitutional views. In other words, if this were a constitutional debate, we'd ask you not whether you think partisan gerrymandering is a good or bad idea, but whether the Constitution allows or forbids it. And there might even be a gap between whether you thought it was a good idea and whether you thought it was constitutionally allowable. But just to make things a little more interesting, that's not what we're doing tonight, because it turns out that the Supreme Court has been kind of mushy about whether or not partisan gerrymandering violates the Constitution. Instead, we're asking this profound civic question for our democracy. Has partisan gerrymandering destroyed the political center? We've just been through this incredible election. The country is so polarized. We're all living in our filter bubbles. And the job tonight is for you to listen to our debaters with an open mind and ask whether partisan gerrymandering is responsible for that or whether it's some other cause. I have to just end with this incredible plug for this phenomenal new app that the National Constitution Center has created, which embodies the IQ Squared partnership as well as everything we're trying to do. It's the Interactive Constitution. You can go to the App Store and download it. Not now, because I'm talking and you got to listen to Bob, but after the show. And you'll find here the American Constitution Society and the Federalist Society, the leading liberal and conservative organizations in America for the Constitution, have nominated scholars to write about every single clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. So this is a living constitutional debate, an amazing tool for constitutional education, and it embodies our mission to bring all sides together in these polarized times.
And the price is?
The price is free, and you can get it right after the show.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
And you can get a Ginsu knife if you order now. It's just incredible.
And Bob, when we do these debates in New York, we always come out and chat a little bit about, lay a little bit of a groundwork for what we're going to be talking about. And I think we have a sense that gerrymandering is somewhat technical, maybe a little bit hard to figure out.
Well, Jeffrey said that this is not exactly a constitutional debate, but the founders did have one very basic idea in mind, and the idea was that the voters would choose their representatives. Well, gerrymandering is not that thing. Gerrymandering is kind of the opposite. It's the representatives choosing their voters. And they're choosing their voters by creating these weirdly misshapen congressional districts or other electoral districts that really influence the outcome of elections in an important way. And one is able, for example, if you had a district with that's 60% blue, let's say 40% red, you could draw the lines in a way that would produce 3 blue districts. You could draw the lines in a way that would produce no blue districts. You could draw the lines in a way that would produce 2 blue districts. So the drawing of the lines can create a huge difference in the outcome, and that drawing of the lines is done by state legislatures, so it's a very highly politicized process. Whether you like that process or not, though, and I don't, frankly, we wouldn't have a debate about whether this is a good or bad idea. This debate is something different. It's about whether the prevalence of gerrymandering does indeed explain the death of the political center. And the theory about why it might is that if you have districts that are safely Democrat or safely Republican, and election doesn't matter. And the only election that does matter is the party primary. And the people who show up to vote in party primaries, by and large, are much to the left of the Democratic Party, much to the right of the Republican Party, and that's what's driving the extremism that we see in politics. But it's also an empirical question. The fact that there's maybe a theory about how it operates doesn't mean that that's in fact true. There's lots of data that can be brought to bear on this, and I think the debaters tonight are going to do just that.
Well, let's welcome them to the stage. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Why don't you welcome our debaters? And while that's happening, I want to point out that our debates live on as a broadcast on public radio and also as a podcast. We're live streaming right now. And because of that, we do want the audience that hears this ultimately to know that you're here, to hear from you, not just in your questions. And so we do not have the no applause rule at all. In fact, we have the opposite. You're applauding points that you like, tells the debaters how they're doing, and it tells the audience who will hear this that there were people, real live people, who were voting at the end of the debate and that you exist. So please do exist with your applause throughout the evening. And in fact, there are going to be a number of times where I'm going to ask you to applaud spontaneously, of course, to help with the production of the final edit. The only thing we don't like to hear is booing and hissing. It doesn't really go along with our goal of raising the level of public discourse. So we're going to get started. Okay then, to launch, I would like to welcome a round of spontaneous applause. In American politics, the center is dead. The election we passed through in 2016 exposed once again the depth of division and also a level of discourse where compromise has been a dirty word. And how did we get to such an extreme state of polarization? Is it something about the internet, or is it about the kinds of people who go into politics? Or is it, as some have argued, the strange American practice known as gerrymandering, where every 10 years the parties redraw the political map to create an advantage for themselves by putting together districts made up overwhelmingly of voters and so uncompetitive that they have no incentive to compromise, and the center dies. Well, that is an intriguing theory, but does it hold up to examination? That sounds like the makings of a debate. So let's have it. Yes or no to this statement: gerrymandering is destroying the political center. A debate from Intelligence Squared US. We are at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., in partnership with the National Constitution Center, with 4 superbly qualified debaters on stage who will argue for and against the motion, gerrymandering is destroying the political center. As always, our debate will go in 3 rounds, and then our live audience here in Washington votes to choose the winner, and only one side wins. Let's go to those keypads and have you vote now as you come off the street on this motion. Gerrymandering is destroying the political center. If you go to the keypad, pay attention to keys number 1, 2, and 3. If you agree with the motion, push number 1. That means you're arguing with this side. You agree with this side's argument. If you disagree with the motion, push number 2. And if you are undecided, push number 3. You can ignore the rest of the keys. They're not live. And if you push the wrong key, just correct yourself, and your last vote will be recorded before we lock out the system. And I'm judging by eye contact that we're done. Okay, and what I want to explain is that at the end of the debate, after you have heard the arguments and judged their quality and persuasiveness, we will have you vote again. And what we do is we look at the difference between the first vote and the second vote, and it's the difference between the two votes that determines our winner. It's the team whose numbers have moved up the most in percentage points who will be declared our victor. Again, our motion is this: gerrymandering is destroying the political center. We have one team arguing for, one team arguing against. Let's meet the team first arguing for the motion. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Daley. Hi, David.
Hello.
So you wrote a book whose name I'm not allowed to say on the radio or in front of small children, so I will try to get around it. The name of the book is Ratf, and it ends in KED, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. What exactly does that term that I can't pronounce mean?
Well, I like to quote the great political philosophers of AC/DC and talk about dirty deeds done dirt cheap. It is a term that goes back to Watergate. You can trace it back through the redistricting battles of the 1990s as a term for political chicanery. And in this most vulgar of years, it seemed like a good way to cut through the system and grab people's attention for a topic that might have put you to sleep in civics class back in 8th grade.
Some time-honored profanity. All right.
Rat bleeped.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and please tell us who your partner is.
I am debating this evening with my friend Caroline Fredrickson.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Caroline Fredrickson. Hi, Caroline. Welcome to Intelligence Squared US. And you are president of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy, a progressive group. And we are wondering, again, we're going to need a lot of background throughout the evening. For those of us not so familiar with gerrymandering, we know that both parties do it. They have been doing it for a few centuries. But does that mean that, technically speaking, it's legal?
It's not. In fact, the Supreme Court has recognized that drawing lines to prevent a legislature from being, quote, collectively responsive to the popular will is actually unconstitutional and has questioned partisan gerrymandering. So no, it's not.
So how do we get to a point where it's happening anyway?
Well, this is, I think people might consider some of the Supreme Court decisions a little vague, and that's because they haven't figured out the standard to how to evaluate when the line has been crossed.
Okay, and that's why we have a debate here tonight. Thank you, the team welcoming for the motion. I think I just misspoke, so I get the chance to rewind and do things over again, so I'm just going to say thank you to the team arguing for the motion. And you have two opponents. Please welcome arguing against the motion first, Chris Jankowski. Chris, you're actually a major character in your opponent's book. You ran a program called Red Map on behalf of the Republican State Leadership Committee, pulling off what many say was the most successful gerrymander of all time on behalf of the Republican Party. Rachel Maddow called you the unsung political genius of our time. And all of this was your idea. Where did that idea come from?
Well, good evening. I would say, it's only going to go downhill from here based on Rachel's billing, but I hate to, the worst part about David's book is it outed me as a New York Times reader. And I was reading a Sunday story in July 2009 that mentioned the upcoming census ongoing and the redistricting and reapportionment that would take place and the significant changes in populations from the Rust Belt down to the Sun Belt, and that state legislatures would be doing these lines. And that, of course, I knew that from college poli-sci probably, but I thought, you know what, we can do something.
So you moved.
We did.
And who was your partner?
Well, I believe you take a gun to a gunfight, and I think you take an Ivy League professor to a debate. So I brought Nolan McCarty.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nolan McCarty. Nolan, it is Princeton indeed. You're chair of the Department of Politics there, and you've been studying politics and wrote a book called Polarized America, which looks at the causes and the results of polarization in American politics. But are we being misty-eyed to look back to the past and say it's never been as bad as it is today?
Well, we have measures of polarization in Congress going back to Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a pretty nasty time. We had just finished the Civil War. One party believed that the other party consisted of traitors. It's worse now.
Wow. Okay, we got a heck of a debate coming up. Ladies and gentlemen, the team arguing against the motion, which once again is gerrymandering, is destroying the political center. Let's move on to round one. Round one comprised of opening statements by each debater in turn. They will be 6 minutes each. They will be uninterrupted. And here, speaking first to get you to vote yes on the motion, gerrymandering is destroying the political center, Caroline Frederickson. She is president of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. Ladies and gentlemen, Caroline Frederickson.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. So I was asked to start off with a little bit of the legal framework. Why do we actually do this? So some of you may know that our Constitution requires that states redraw our congressional and state legislative district lines every 10 years. And as our country grew after its founding, it didn't grow equally, as you might guess. Some towns and counties grew larger than others. And some jurisdictions actually took account of that and changed their district lines, but others didn't. So for an example, in Tennessee from 1901 to 1961, the legislature just ignored the requirement to redraw district lines. Another example, in Alabama, you had, in addition to the literacy tests and poll taxes that kept African Americans from registering to vote, you had malapportionment that helped preserve the power of segregationists in places like Lowndes County, Alabama. In that county, you had 15,000 approximately residents who had as many representatives in the Alabama Senate as the 600,000 residents of Birmingham's Jefferson County. Well, the Supreme Court ended this perversion of democracy in a series of landmark cases in the 60s, ruling that legislative districts had to be roughly equal in population. They're known as the one-person, one-vote cases. And so district boundaries now are being readjusted to account for new population information. And so when the census is conducted at the start of the new decade, district boundaries have to be redrawn. And so we have this redistricting and gerrymandering. So as you know, the gerrymandering is nothing new. It's named after Elbridge Gerry, who was the Massachusetts governor and future vice president, who in 1812 signed a redistricting plan that benefited his own party. It looked a lot like a salamander, and hence the gerrymander. But just because it was done in the past doesn't make it any less insidious and any less anti-democratic. And now we have these sophisticated technologies and maps that allow it to become so much worse. And as you know, maps tend to be drawn by the state legislators. Legislators are very self-interested in this process, and this gives them the tools to figure out exactly what they want their own district and their own voters to look like for the next 10 years. And because the parties have learned that they can gain many votes by altering the mix of who votes rather than assuming the median positions of the likely electorate. And they can speak more directly to partisans and donors, the extremes, really, through the micro-targeting that is available to them. And these base voters are then the key to the primary. With districts that are configured like this to benefit the incumbent or one party, the primary becomes the only thing that matters. And so you can look in 2012 and 2014 where you had partisan asymmetry that was at its highest level in 40 years. And that's measured by how one party can get more seats than its votes should allow. The districts are structured not to be competitive. So as I mentioned, the Supreme Court has raised concerns about partisan gerrymandering as being unconstitutional, as not when the districts are not collectively responsible to the popular will. And the reason for this is that the redistricting requirement was meant to create fairness and balance. The districts were created, the drawing was meant to keep them fair and the populations balanced. And not, and I will quote from a piece that was in the Washington Post by Phil Andrews, a former county councilman in Montgomery County, Maryland. He said the 3rd District of Maryland staggers like a drunken sailor from Annapolis to Olney. And you would have to look at it, and you can see it actually does kind of look like a drunken sailor staggering. That's not what the Founding Fathers were intending when they said that we should have this process go on. Madison actually said that the House was meant to be a numerous and changeable body, where the members would have a, quote, habitual recollection of their dependence to the people. Madison said, every new election in the states will change 1/2 of the representatives. Well, as you know, we have elections where almost nobody in the House changes unless they'd happen to retire. So we can see that we have a situation where the gerrymandering has significantly added to the level of polarization. You have districts that have no competition, and hence only the incumbent runs for re-election because it's really not worth it for anybody else. There are so few competitive districts. And that leads to disincentivizing dialogue because there's no reason to talk to somebody on the other side of the aisle, because if you do and you compromise, you'll have a primary attack. And the primary, as I mentioned, is the only election that matters. So I would just end with a couple other points about why this has contributed so significantly to the destruction of the middle. When there's only one person on the ballot or only one party that can win a district, the citizens are essentially have no way to hold that individual accountable. They have no choice. As a result, people stop voting. Turnout goes down. And let me remind you that primaries, and since primaries are often now the only vote that matters, primaries are already a low turnout operation, exaggerating even more how far to the extreme and out of the middle both the voters are and those people who are responding to them, the elected officials. So I just want to quote, to close, in the same set of articles yesterday in the Washington Post, there was an expert, Ross Lawrence from the American Enterprise Institute, a Republican, who talked about why it is that competitive elections are good for voters. He reminds us that one-party dominance is a recipe for corruption and complacency. So I ask you, give us your vote, because it's clear that gerrymandering is destroying the political center. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline Frederickson. And that is the motion. Gerrymandering is destroying the political center. Here to get you to vote no on this motion, I want to bring to the lectern Nolan McCarty. He is the Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton. I allowed your opponent to go over 30 seconds. If you need it, you'll get the same privilege. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Nolan McCarty.
At the heart of tonight's debate is the question of whether gerrymandering can be blamed for what political scientists and others have called polarization. For our purposes tonight, polarization can be thought of as the disappearance of moderate views from politics and the increased likelihood of extreme ones. The system often manifests itself in extreme differences between the two parties. Polarization can appear at two different levels. It can appear among elites, like in Congress, so we see the hollowing out of moderates in Congress, or it can happen in the electorate, where we see the disengagement of moderate voters. The conventional wisdom among political scientists is that polarization is primarily an elite phenomenon. At least it started there, and that's most clear in the data. Voter polarization emerged much later and is more empirically ambiguous and is often driven by elite behavior. I am going to focus on the extent to which gerrymandering is related to elite polarization. My partner will take up questions of voter polarization. My focus on Congress has at least two advantages. First, it's well studied, and there's a historical record of congressional voting on bills. And polarization in Congress is obviously directly pertinent to questions about the effects of gerrymandering. So let me start with just giving you some data and some facts about polarization in Congress. So in my work, I've measured polarization in Congress by levels of partisanship and ideological division on roll call votes on legislation. These measures have varied greatly over 140 years since Reconstruction, which I mentioned before. It was obviously high during Reconstruction in the Gilded Age through about 1920. It was low from the 1930s to the 1970s, and a dramatic growth began in the late 1970s. And as I said before, now we're at an all-time high. Second fact, the House and the Senate have polarized more or less in tandem. There's no significant differences between the trends and the turning points between those two chambers. And the data also suggests that the trends are very long-term with very few abrupt changes, reflecting the obvious role of deep cultural changes, economic and technological shifts, and demography. Given these long-term trends, I argue that it's very doubtful that any small change in electoral procedure, such as the way we draw districts, can really account for what's going on. So the first point I want to make in support of that argument is to go to the theoretical argument that people have made about how it is that partisan gerrymandering is supposed to increase polarization. I would argue it's very important not to conflate partisan gerrymandering, the attempt that majority parties do to try to maximize the number of seats, and incumbency protection gerrymandering, the role that incumbents might play in creating safe seats. They're not the same and they're very different. So let me give you an example to show how the argument underlying this case doesn't make any sense. So consider a state with two districts, and we'll say that Party A has an advantage across the state. Say they get 53% of the votes, so they're a slight majority party. They get to draw the district boundaries and can do so to get any allocation of partisans into districts. In such a scenario, Party A has essentially two choices. One, it can do the partisan gerrymandering. It can create two identical districts so that it gets 53% in both of those districts. Or it can do incumbency protection. It can create a safe Party A district and a safe Party B district. Now note that the one with the safe districts is the incumbency protection gerrymander. It's not the partisan gerrymandering. The partisan gerrymandering gives the incumbents of the majority party much narrower margins than the incumbency protection. So it's really not partisan gerrymandering. Its effects on polarization just aren't clear theoretically. But I'm an empiricist, so let me talk a little bit about the data against the proposition. First of all, as I've already alluded to, the Senate. Since the Dakotas were split in the 1890s to give the Republicans 4 senators instead of 2, the Senate has not been gerrymandered, yet the data show it's just as polarized as the House of Representatives. Small states can't be gerrymandered. There's states with 1 member of Congress. They send extreme members to Congress all the time. Recall a certain Vermont senator was a socialist until he became a Democrat. That's from a state with 1 House member. If you look at state legislatures, lower and upper chambers are equally polarized. Lower chambers are easy to gerrymander than upper chambers. Why are they the same if this is what's going on? Turns out if you look at the geography, extreme partisan districts are no more frequent than extreme counties. So the underlying geography of the United States is one that's quite polarized, and the districts themselves are not much more polarized than the underlying geography. And then finally, and most importantly, polarization does not seem to increase disproportionately around reapportionment years. It increases in off years every year. In fact, since 1977, it's increased every year, and the increases around reapportionment are no bigger than they are around other years. Just a few other points of more perhaps sophisticated evidence. It's important to note that since the 1970s, the main growth in polarization measured by the differences between the parties and their voting records has been the polarization that's occurred in partisan competitive districts. It's not because there are fewer competitive districts. Even in those districts where Democrat and Republican voters are at roughly equal strengths, they send members of Congress who are just as polarized as the other types of districts. Finally, more sophisticated evidence based on simulations where we can simulate any type of districting we want, partisan incumbency gerrymandering, this type of gerrymandering versus that type of gerrymandering shows it has very, very little effect on levels of polarization. So I conclude, based on the theory, which I don't think makes any sense, and the data, which doesn't support it, that the proposition should be rejected.
Thank you, Noel McCarty. And a reminder of what's going on. We are halfway through the opening round of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, fighting it out over this motion: gerrymandering is destroying the political center. You have heard the first 2 opening statements, and now on to the third. Standing at the lectern is David Daley, who is author of the book Ratf, The True Story Behind the Secret Plan to Steal America's Democracy. He's also publisher of the Connecticut Mirror. He will be up here trying to persuade you to vote yes. Please welcome David Daley.
I want to tell you all a story about what happened in Florida in December of 2010, just a few weeks after upwards of 60% of the state's voters in 2010, a big Tea Party year. Voters couldn't agree on much of anything in 2010. They did back 2 constitutional amendments mandating that all redistricting be conducted without any partisan intent. It did not take but a couple of weeks for the smartest Republican strategists in the state, guys who run firms like data targeting and strategic direction, guys who make deep into 6 figures every year to do things like be a redistricting coordinator, to gather at GOP headquarters in Tallahassee with legislative leaders and top aides and bold-faced names from Washington. The goal, launching a sophisticated and highly concealed campaign to run 2 redistricting processes in Florida, one public, one in the shadows, both in their control and loaded with partisan intent. They might have gotten away with it, except the lawsuit brought by the reformers uncovered the meeting's agenda. Questions like communication with outside lawyers. How can we make that work? Evolution of maps. Should they start less compliant and evolve through the process? Or should the first map be as compliant as possible and then change very little? A furious federal judge in 2014 declares several of these districts unconstitutional, orders new maps in light of a conspiracy to manipulate and influence redistricting that made a mockery out of the claimed transparency and tainted the process with improper partisan intent. Why? If the professor and his tables about partisanship and polarization are correct, would these highly accomplished and highly paid strategists and elected officials take such risks as to violate constitutional amendments? Perhaps the politicos know something truer about the district lines. Something like this: that all components of a successful congressional race, including recruitment, message development, and resource allocation, rest on the congressional district lines, and this was an area where Republicans had an unquestioned advantage. Those are not my words. Those come from the triumphant 2012 annual report of Chris Jankowski's Republican State Leadership Committee, a victory lap after his party retained a 33-seat majority in the House that year, despite 1.4 million fewer votes, thanks to their audacious reinvention of the oldest political trick in the book, the gerrymander, and a strategy called red map. We are here to ask whether gerrymandering has destroyed the political center. Yes, it did. The center has been an endangered species for some time, yes, but its destruction accelerates in 2010 and 2011, just as Republicans take what Harvard political scientist Theda Skocpol describes as the biggest lurch in one direction, the right, since anyone began recording legislators' voting records, and a deep electoral discontent settled into our politics. We all know that this is true. The center has been erased with the click of a mapmaker's mouse. It's been drawn away. We are a 50-50 nation, but an uncompetitive one, dominated at the legislative level by the rule of one party. The gerrymander is at the root of it. Democrats have taken the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 elections. Ballot splitting reached a 100-plus year low in 2012. And yet, for the last 6 years, Republicans have claimed their biggest sustained congressional majorities ever, even in years when they get fewer votes. Since 2010, they've also ended parity at the state legislative level. They now control 67 of 98 state legislative chambers and hundreds more seats than Democrats. So why is it that despite regularly winning a majority of voters, Democrats have no power? It is because Chris understands something his partner wants to dismiss. When you draw the lines, you make the rules. And when you draw the lines with the breathtaking technological tools available today, you make the rules for a decade, and these rules changed forever in 2010 with a red map. Chris masterminded this strategy in 2009 and 2010 with the stated goal of flipping state legislatures, ensuring Republicans would be the only people in the room when the new district lines were drawn in 2011. The rationale was straightforward, he writes, or a Red Maps report writes, controlling the redistricting process in these states would have the greatest impact on determining how both state legislative and congressional district boundaries would be drawn. Drawing new lines in states with the most redistricting activity presented the opportunity to solidify conservative policymaking and maintain a Republican stronghold in the House for the next decade. This is how you destroy, even nullify the center and advance your agenda in a 50-50 polarized world. It's polarization that has made extreme gerrymandering so effective. When we are as polarized as this, the most essential element becomes where you draw the lines, how you distribute the voters. This is how the center gets destroyed, how National Journal can find 137 congressional centrists in 2002 and 4 in 2012. That's how Nate Silver can find 133 swing districts to 35 between 1992 and 2012. This plan works better than Republicans even expected. They were able in 2011 to draw 193 of the 435 districts themselves after the 2010 elections. Democrats had complete control over just 44. This election year, we're down to 37 competitive seats. Destroying swing districts and gutting these last outposts of centrism and debate is the goal. You could blame polarization for this. You could blame geography for this. You could blame partisanship for this. Or you can simply take the Republicans at their word. Thank you.
Thank you, David Daley. Our motion again, gerrymandering, is destroying the political center, and here to make his argument against this motion to get you to vote no is Chris Jankowski. He's a political strategist and former executive director of the Red Map Project at the Republican State Leadership Committee. Please welcome Chris Jankowski.
Thank you. I was briefly a prosecutor before I became a career political hack, and what David just did reminds me of when a prosecutor gets up and starts throwing out all kinds of unflattering information to the jury, but it isn't really relevant to the charges. And so I completely plead guilty to everything he just laid out, and that was playing by the rules and maximizing the impact on the American political system. But the question before you is, does gerrymandering cause the polarization, which is destroying the American center? And so what I want to talk about is the fact that the swing voter in America has been disappearing for the last 20 years and has just we've just reached a new height in that. I would point you to a New York Times article in August of 2012 written by Rebecca Berg, and she looked at all the academic research available at that time. She interviewed experts on both sides of the aisle, and she concluded that even among so-called self-identified swing voters in America at that time, half of them vote for one party or the other party all the time. They want to identify themselves as not being affiliated with a particular party, but if you look at their actual voting behavior, half of them already have a team. They have a jersey on, they just have a coat over. And so I think that's important. And if you take that, say there's 10 or 15% is the typical national number of swing voters. We talk about playing this game between the 40-yard lines, et cetera. You take half of that and say it's 7.5%. And you take that and you ignore California and Texas and some of the bigger states that skew one way or the other, and you try to apply it to our electoral system in the battleground states. And from what I can tell, you got about 500,000 households that are really up for grab in a national election. And that to me is polarization. I mean, we have gotten to the point where we have our jerseys and we put them on come election time. We try not to, but by the time the election rolls around, we have them on for the most part. The other thing to point out is Pew has done quite a bit of research the last 25 years. They do this value study. They've updated it 14 times. In 2014, they issued a report that's called the Polarization in the American Public. And one of the things they cited in there, a couple points I want to leave you with. First is the percentage of voters in America who identify solely and extremely with the liberal or conservative view has doubled from 10 to 21%. When you extrapolate that out to likely voters, and it's a bigger part of the electorate. But what really got me was that the percentage of voters who believe that the other party that they oppose, that they threaten the well-being of the nation. That's the wording of the question, the well-being of the nation. That percentage has doubled. 37% of Republicans felt that way in 2014 and 27% of Democrats. That's over 60% of the voters. 6 in 10 Americans think that the other party, should they get complete control, would threaten the very foundations of the country, the well-being. And I'm not even one of them. But 6 in 10. So we start with a very small, narrow path if you want to talk about who the swing voters, who's actually persuadable and who switches. I'm not saying they don't exist, but if you look at the data, that was from 1994 to 2004. In 20 years, we got more polarized. And it had nothing to do with the gerrymandering that took place after 2010. I mean, it just doesn't. I mean, you cannot look at 20 to 25 years of history and a clear trend and then say, oh, but these last few years have made the difference. The other part is I'd like to talk about briefly is what I actually do, which is a political consultant and run campaigns. And another thing I see in voter behavior, and voters are the consumers that we as consultants and politicians are trying to gain, and they have siloed themselves off in America in self-reinforcing silos through social media, through where they live and who they associate with, and through obviously the notorious cable news networks. And so that voters across the spectrum are getting what they want to hear. They block out what they don't want to hear. And that has further, I would argue, created this polarization in the data that Pew has picked up on. That all that technology and social media, it's just gone up. And for people like me, we take advantage of that. Yes, we do a poll at the beginning. We do research and we do polling and before we start a race, and we look at how we're going to build that 51%. But then we start slicing and dicing it, and we say, how are we going to talk to that group of voters without this group of voters seeing it? What goes on TV is usually the last thing. It's the least efficient cost in a campaign, and in terms of the marginal votes that it can change, and it's the least important. Today's elections are about turning out the people that already agree with you. And I'll touch on that in the conclusion later. Finally, just a show of hands, how many members of the NRA are here today? None. All right, well, I'll keep my hand up. So if you're not a member of the NRA, you've never been subjected to the deluge of phone calls, stuff on your phone, social media, online outreach, mailbox, door knocks, with strong Second Amendment issues. But I can assure you it goes on, and because the NRA wouldn't admit it, but in most instances the gun issue probably works against them net. They are still very effective because of all the tools and the trends that I just mentioned at motivating those single issue voters. And I would submit to you that that happens with every segment of the electorate. Both parties have their different blocks they have to get out and how to talk to them. The key is to do it without making the other side notice or get excited. And that's polarization, folks.
Thank you, Chris Jankowski. And that concludes round one of this Intelligence Squared US debate, where our motion is gerrymandering is destroying the political center. Now we move on to round two, and in round two, the debaters address one another directly, and they also take questions from me and from you in our live audience here at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. The team arguing for the motion, Caroline Fredrickson and Dave Daley, they have told us that politics work best when there is competition, but that gerrymandering takes competition out of the equation, creating safe seats where being extreme does not cause politicians' votes, and so that the only election ultimately that matters will be the primary. That as a result of this, there is a disincentive to dialogue, a disincentive to compromise. They say that the center has been drawn away by partisan map makers. The team on the opposite side that wants you to vote against this motion, Nolan McCarty and Chris Jankowski, they agree that our politics is polarized and possibly even broken, but they don't think that that has much to do with gerrymandering. Their evidence shows that politicians are taking their positions, sometimes extreme positions, regardless of how safe their seats are,
and reflects actually a polarization in the electorate itself. They say it's the underlying geography that determines polarization, that the swing voters have been vanishing on their own, and that as for the rest, they are separating themselves into silos, and that is the source of polarization. I want to go first to the team arguing for the motion. Start with Caroline Frederickson. One point your opponents made in terms of refuting your gerrymandering argument as destructive to the political center is that they cited the fact that the Senate, the U.S. Senate, is likewise highly polarized, but it's not a body whose districts are defined by gerrymandering. They're defined by state borders. What's your response to that?
Well, I actually think we've seen more effort at compromise in the Senate than we have in the House, certainly. I'd say one fact is that the control of the Senate has actually changed hands between the parties more often since the 80s than the House has. So clearly it's the fact that the districts are more competitive to some extent in the Senate is a reflection of an easier ability to have more debate. And the Senate is the place where they have actually tried to work together on some issues. Immigration reform, where you had Marco Rubio working across the aisle. And I think, I worked in the Senate for 10 years, and I think it's a place where you had the Gang of 14. You don't see anything like that in the House, where they just talk to each other. One side only talks to each other, and some of the most extreme behaviors have been in the House.
Okay, so Nolan McCarty, your point about the Senate being refuted by Caroline Frederickson, who's saying that in fact the Senate does have more of a functional center than the House.
I think she just made a wonderful argument for the filibuster. The reason why we see much more bipartisan cooperation in the Senate, despite the polarized differences, is because the minority party always has the opportunity to block legislation through the filibuster. I believe if we got rid of the filibuster, you'd see just as much partisanship in the Senate as you would see in the House, which is sort of consistent with the data. I would also just point out, that also doesn't deal with the small state problem. If you look, small state representatives who've never been gerrymandered, they take very extreme positions. They're no different than those from large states, which presumably might have been gerrymandered.
Caroline, you want to respond to that?
Well, I think the Senate certainly has its own unique elements to it. And the fact that there's generally been polarization in the country doesn't mean that that there isn't more polarization due to gerrymandering. And the fact that the House is more polarized than the Senate. That the Senate was created to be somewhat more conservative in its structure from the Constitution, having every state represented with the same number of senators. It has had different rules and anti-majoritarian principles. The filibuster, for example, that I think have led it somewhat in a different direction. But the fact of the matter is that the House was supposed to be where there was more change going on. As I mentioned, Madison's understanding was that every election you'd have 50% turnover, and that clearly has not happened, and we've gotten to a state where the incumbents have such protection that almost none of them turn over.
Chris Jankowski, you want to respond to that? And if not, I have a question for you.
I really don't want to respond to that.
Okay, I'm going to give you the question then. Your opponent, I think David Daley, anticipated your argument that polarization has been going on for a while, for 25 years, it's a process, by saying, yeah, but it sure has accelerated a whole lot, meaningfully, significantly, as a result of particularly the last round of gerrymandering by the Republican Party. So he's saying it's not the same because it got so much more intense. Your response to that?
Well, that's true. I mean, it doesn't mean that that's what's caused the polarization, though, in the American electorate as a whole. So
let me just interrupt you. I believe he is arguing that it's causing it. So can you respond?
Yeah, he's saying it. He's not proving it. Is what I would respond. I would say that if you look at the research that I cited, it's been a progression since at least 1994 of increased polarization. But what he's alluding to is accurate. It's gotten down to an iPad level technology, and the the data on every single one of us that's available, and how you can sort voters has just gotten amazingly easier and more precise. And so, yes, the gerrymander is as effective as it's ever been in terms of trying to maintain a majority. That's not the same as protecting incumbents, for sure. But what I don't see is the connection. There's just a lack of proof that that is causing what we saw in our presidential primaries, where we had the left and the right pull both ways. There was no gerrymandering in that. In any of these Senate governor's races, the presidential race, very polarized electorate, not gerrymandered.
David Daley?
Chris does a really good job of redrawing the lines, and I think he just did that a little bit there. I think what we want to keep in mind is he talked a lot about where the swing voters sit. When these lines are being drawn, it's not simply about where the swing voters sit, it's where all the voters sit. So you take a state like Pennsylvania, for example, which in 2012 and in 2008 both go for Democratic. If you add up all the votes in the state for Democratic House candidates in 2008 and 2012, it's about the same 100,000 margin in favor of the Democrats. In 2008, the Democrats win 12 seats. In 2012, they win 5 seats. Did the polarization increase? Did everybody move to Philadelphia? No, the lines changed in the middle. Democrats get themselves packed into 5 seats. They win with percentages of 85, 89, 77, 69, and 61. There's a close race, and the other races get won by margins of 13, 25, 14, 19, 13, 23, 31, 17, 13, 16, and 26. Again, those margins in that many districts in a state that the Democrats get more votes, and in a year in which there's less ballot splitting than ever before, the lines have a special primacy. And there is academic research on this. You can look to Harvard and Theda Skocpol, who has laid out the biggest lurch to the right since political scientists began studying voting records of legislators between 2010 and 2016. You can look at the work of Michael Latner at Cal Poly, who takes a look at the seat-vote ratio in the 2000s and says that the Republicans have an asymmetry of 3.4, and takes a look at it after 2011, and the asymmetry goes to 9.39. You can take a look at the work that Professors Chen of Michigan and Rodden of Stanford have done when they took a look at those Florida seats that we talked about.
Let's let your opponents respond to some of what you're saying, Nolan McCarty.
Yeah, I would like to reiterate there's a really huge conflation in this debate between the idea that the majority party does bad things to maximize its seat share. They tend to spread their voters out and pack the opposition voters so they can get more seats. That's quite different than saying that politicians intentionally create safe districts and polarize the system.
Take a minute for what is the big difference?
Well, so again, if we go back to the example I gave in my opening remarks. If you have a party that's a majority party, they really have two choices. They can kind of spread their voters out so that they have a bare or close to bare majority in as many districts as they can, and then they pack the opposition party. Now, the opposition party may be polarized because they're packed, but you're creating a bunch of districts that, if they miscalculate, for example, could go the other way. They're not increasing the safety. A good example, during the notorious mid-decade gerrymandering in Texas in 2003, Tom DeLay actually reduced his district from 57% Republican to 52% Republican. And he almost lost the next election. That is the mechanism behind the partisan gerrymander. It's not making the majority party safer. It's spreading the majority party out in the hopes of winning more seats.
All right, Carolyn Frederickson, that was the second time at my request that Nolan McCarty explained that point of view, the distinction he's making between incumbency protection and partisan gerrymandering, which he says in his opening means your theory makes no sense. What's your response?
Well,
to
I
that?
actually wanted to say these aren't the only options, right? I mean, as we could actually take this out of the hands of politicians. We've had a number of states that have gone in that direction because I think most people agree intuitively with the proposition that when politicians decide what the districts look like, it's going to be biased and unfair, and if I could use a commonly used word, rigged. And so when you actually give an independent, nonpartisan body the ability to create maps, they make really different maps. And what happens is that there's actually more competition, and that the districts then the members are more responsive to the voters. And you can see that how this plays out, because when you've had citizen redistricting commissions or these nonpartisan redistricting commissions, you have many more of these districts that have more than one major party on the ballot. Because when you have the non-competitive districts, as I said, the other party doesn't really bother to even run, because there's no way to get elected. It's just the primary that matters. And that really changes when you have a nonpartisan process. So
you're saying you believe there is a decrease in polarization that can be seen, can
absolutely.
be spotted? Now let's take it to the other side. So your opponents are now arguing that a sort of reverse gerrymandering, or a more fair redistricting that might lead us away from the pejorative term gerrymandering, has in fact resulted in less polarization. What about that, Chris Jankowski?
Well, I think that it's an inherently political function to draw these lines. And if you go back to our founders in the Constitution, they tended to put the inherently political things into the hands of the political people, which would be the legislative chamber, the legislative branch, if you will.
And by political, do you mean an action taken to benefit one party's interests?
No, I mean the people who are most accountable to the voters.
Okay.
And subject to that. And so I'm not against reforming redistricting. I'd just like to see a fair system. I don't think this system is necessarily the most fair. I think we need some guardrails. I think maybe the courts are going to do that personally. But I think that this idea that there's a such thing as a neutral redistricting process.
But Carolyn's point,
hasn't been
Carolyn's
proven.
point wasn't that there, at this moment, she wasn't making the argument there should be this process. She is saying that in examples where this process was followed, more competitive districts were created, and therefore polarization was reduced. So that's really the question to you.
Sure.
Do you want to take it? Noah?
Well, actually, I think I can. I mean, Arizona has the infamous commission. Just look at the election we just had in Arizona for president. It was racially polarized between the white and non-white vote. It was polarized by income, by education levels. It was just a microcosm of what went on in America. Those folks have picked their jerseys and they have picked their team. And the fact that they're stuck in a particular congressional district that may be more competitive and more fair, if you will, doesn't change their behavior. It doesn't make them less partisan. You run a statewide race in Arizona the same way you'd run it in Pennsylvania, which, by the way, Trump won this year. So I think it does defeat some of the taint on the redistricting that was done in Pennsylvania.
Would you like to respond, David Daley?
Yes, I think that Arizona is certainly a classic example of a state where nonpartisan redistricting is nonpartisan in name only. It's really partisan redistricting, just in a smaller room. But what I think we're not getting at here is that incumbent protection gerrymandering is what the Democrats do in Maryland, for example, where they get 7 out of 8 seats that they shouldn't have. It should probably be a 5-3 delegation if you were to go, based on fairness. The partisan gerrymandering that we see explode after 2010 is the kind of gerrymandering that takes a state like Michigan, where Democrats get 240,000 more votes, and packs them into 5 districts and gives Republicans 9 of the 14 seats. It's taking a 50-50 state like Ohio and making the delegation 12-4. It's taking a state where in 2012 more votes again for Democratic candidates, but the delegation goes 10-3 Republican. And that can't but affect the kind of politics we have. There is still a center in this country. There is still a center where folks, and you can look at the polls, 55% in favor of common sense gun control, 50-44 on abortion. Should the next president support or oppose climate change? 69-23. Should we let undocumented immigrants stay who meet certain standards? 72%. There is a center, even on the issues that we are told are the most hot button. Are we getting any action from this Congress on any of these issues? No.
So what do you mean by, if you look at our motion, when you say destroying the political center, you don't mean causing those voters not to exist who would held more centrist views? You mean what?
I'm saying that we are electing politicians who will not represent the center because they are not accountable to anybody.
I just wanted to add one point to why I agree so much with David's initial point, is that you have to remember that not only are primaries, as I said, the only election that matters, that they're low turnout, but then in many states where you have unaffiliated voters, they're not allowed to participate in the primary. So you're really seeing a situation where the most partisan people have the most ability to affect the outcome of elections. And the rest of the people who may be independent voters, unaffiliated, or just disgusted by how partisan the person is who's being elected, just opt out. And that means that those people are not having anybody speak for them. I think that's why you can say that the middle is being destroyed.
Okay, Noel McCarty, I let your opponents go twice in a row, so you can do the same, but a lot said by your opponents just now. Do you want to respond to any of it in particular?
Yes. So I think data is very important for these discussions. I mean, I think we can come up with anecdotes and stories. It might surprise most people, but the correlation between how extreme a member represents his or her district and how competitive that district is almost zero. The Republicans in safe districts and in competitive districts are just as conservative. Democrats who represent safe districts and competitive districts are just as liberal. So I agree that lots of things can be done by the majority party to skew in favor of them in terms of the number of seats. But whether or not that is actually reducing the number of moderates in Congress, it just doesn't jive with the data. On the point of nonpartisan redistricting, the best example of that is the state of Iowa. In Iowa, two bureaucrats get in a room and they redivide the state into 4 quadrants, and they just move the boundaries just to make sure the 4 quadrants are the same. You can't imagine a more technocratic exercise in gerrymandering than that. But the members of the Iowa delegation are just as extreme within their parties as we would be expected if it were a state that didn't have that.
So you're saying the safetiness of your seat has nothing to do, does not correlate with the extremity of a politician's views?
Not really. On the Republican side, it's 0. On the Democratic side, minority districts are quite different, but among non-minority districts, there's almost no correlation.
Let me bring that back to your opponents, because it's sort of a direct assault on their premise that there's a little incentive to compromise whatsoever. But what do you make of that, David Daley?
I think the danger here is that what we've created is a system in which there is no way to hold a party accountable or individuals accountable. And I look again, and I think that there is, plenty of data here from serious thinkers, whether they're at Stanford or whether they're at Harvard, or many other schools who have noticed and observed what changes in 2010. It's not necessarily rocket science to see how these lines move and what the result is in our politics. And I go back to North Carolina and a new district that was drawn for that was a Democratic district out in the mountains part of the state where Heath Schuler, formerly a quarterback here in Washington, played. And they crack Asheville in half, split it in 2, and it elects a second Republican, a guy named Mark Meadows. And it's Mark Meadows who goes to Washington and essentially is the key driver behind the government shutdown in 2012, is the key driver behind the parliamentary move to oust John Boehner last year. And Mark Meadows would not have been in Congress had that district not have been drawn in that way. That district once sent a conservative Democrat, a moderate Democrat, somebody who opposed Nancy Pelosi. After redistricting, it sends somebody who shuts down the government and goes after the speaker of his own party.
All right, I want to go to audience questions now, and the way this will work, I'll call on you. If you could stand up, we need to hear your voice also through our recording, so please wait for a microphone to be brought to you. There will be people walking around. I'd appreciate it if you would state your name, and if you're writing or communicating about this publicly, if you're a journalist or a blogger, we'd appreciate knowing that. And the last part is I need you to be terse and actually ask a question. In the back row, very back row, yeah. No, I was speaking to the, yep, thank you. And if you could stand up so we can see you. Can you just tell us your name, please?
Hi, my name is Faith Doyle. I was curious, I'm really unclear as to what your definition of the center is, because it seems like you're talking about either politicians that we elect that are able to compromise, or is it representation for people who are more, or are less, I guess, less
Okay.
politically ideological?
Great question. I have a feeling we might hear slightly different answers, but I want to go to Nolan McCarty with the numbers, what you mean by the center, and then I want to go to Caroline Fredrickson.
At one time in the United States House and in the Senate, there were a number of Democrats who compiled more conservative voting records than many Republicans, and many Republicans who compiled more liberal voting records than many Democrats. So there was a center in which the parties were close together and they interacted and they overlapped. In the data now, that's missing. We don't see those sorts of conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans. There's a gap.
So to use Chris's term, there was a time when people would put on their jerseys, but they wouldn't always play for the team.
They would occasionally dance with the other side.
We're going to mix some metaphors here. Okay, so by the center you mean being able to cross-compromise, vote for, not strictly with the party, with the tribe.
I don't have any disagreement with that. I'd say, from my experience, as I mentioned, I spent a number of years working in the Senate. I'd also worked on the House side, and there was so much more collaboration. Certainly, things were partisan in those days, but the change has been, I think, the fact that it's very hard to work across the aisle and not get in trouble.
Okay, so by center, then it sounds like we're not talking about the existence of the electorate, we're talking about the behavior of the politicians who are elected. That's what we're talking about. Okay, I hope that clarified. Thank you for that, and thanks for that question. Sir.
Hi, my name is Michael. I'm a grad student here in DC. I wanted to pick up on something that Professor McCarty had mentioned earlier. You're talking about the partisan redistricting, where the majority party is trying to sort of spread out, and they can pack the other party into compact districts. And you said that might make the other party more polarized, which sounded like it was sort of making the opponent's argument for them. So I wondered if you could clarify that or follow up with that.
Great question.
Sure. That's quite possible. But in all of this discussion about the lack of the political center, the notion has been that there are too many Republicans, not that there are too few Democrats, and that they're packed into homogeneous districts.
Does that answer your question?
Well, I mean, it could be the other way around. I know we're talking about sort of what's happening now, but objective.
Well, if the argument is that homogeneous districts create polarization, the largest number of districts will be less homogeneous because those are the districts held by the majority party. Some districts will be more homogeneous, but by definition of it being the minority party, there'll be fewer of those.
Okay, thank you. Right down front here, and wait for the mic to find you. It's coming down the aisle.
Hi, my name is Sarah Strader, and I have a question for this side. It seems that
just for those who can't see you, you want to ask?
for the team for the motion.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. It seems that a strong correlation has been drawn between gerrymandering and voter polarization, but I wonder if it's possible that the direction of causation could be reversed. So could it be that the shrinking of the political center has itself played a role in causing the recent uptake in dramatic gerrymandering, that partisans don't think they can win over non-existent moderates, so as a result, they then resort to more heavily redistricting?
What a fantastic question. David, do you want to take that? And I do want to let the other side respond to that question as well.
Sure.
David Daley.
I think we just saw an election in which lots of states that hadn't flipped in many years did flip, and and go the other way. So certainly there are still people out there who are open to persuasion and possibility. What has changed over time is the amount of data that is available to these map makers, and I mean, really, 2010 is ground zero for this. I mean, think about the way you texted in 2000 or even 2003. It was completely different than what you're able to do in 2011 when these map makers draw the lines, and the kind of information that they have. When these maps zig and zag, we used to look at them and say, "Oh, that's just a funny Rorschach test. It's it's a drunken sailor." But I mean, I got out and I drove them as I was writing this book, and you see the purpose and the mission behind them when you are up close. You see the way the neighborhoods change across a street even sometimes, and why those lines are there. And it's because the data is so good that those of us who are persuadable, they know who you are. Those of you who are not persuadable, they've got a pretty good sense of who you are, and they can draw these in such a way that even these districts that look like they're 53, 54, 55% districts, that's solid these days because they know who the 53 are. They know if you turn out, and they can take all of these public record data sets and match them up against your consumer preferences, against the census.
Okay, let me let Chris Jankowski respond as well.
Well, sure. First, there weren't a bunch of states that flipped. There were a small handful. And what happened in those states? Wisconsin, Trump won by about 27,000 votes. Turnout was up 124,000 votes from 12. But Clinton got 231,000 fewer votes. 231,000 fewer votes than Obama in 12. And when you look at where those fewer votes came out of, they are Democrat base areas. The base did not come out. It wasn't, sure, Trump did a better job in, quote, flipping the map, yes, and bringing the blue-collar white voter over. Yes, they turned out more. But those kind of numbers are only made up by a complete loss of Democrat-based votes. Same thing at Michigan, 13,000 vote margin roughly right now. They're still going, I believe. That's a 58,000 more voters turned out overall from 12. Almost 300,000 fewer votes for Clinton. And when you look at it, and the voter file will be available, but you can already see from the returns that came from the Democrat base area. So bases, adjustments in bases are changing these elections and flipping them.
And how does what you're saying support your point in the motion? Argument of the motion.
To go back to earlier questions and volleys on how do I define the center? The center is that group of voters in the middle that are willing to go between elections and switch parties based on the candidate. And the objective data that we've provided, the Pew research, shows that 6 in 10 of Americans not only won't switch, they think the other party's going to destroy the country. And it doesn't get that much better for the next 30%. And so what I see over and over again, you can talk about the issues without putting a partisan label. You can talk about gun control, you can talk about education, you can talk about school choice, you can talk about abortion, you name it. And you can focus group it, and I have many focus groups. As soon as you start putting partisan labels on it, and a label on candidate X is a Republican, this is a Democrat, people divide. And that narrow center is very small. That is the polarization. Gerrymandering has been indicted, convicted, and sentenced to life tonight, and fine. It doesn't prove their proposition. America is divided and polarized, and you can see it from what happened last week.
Okay, I want to point out that we have two definitions of the center now to go to your question. One is about the voters, and one is about the behavior of politicians. So you have to sort that out as you vote. Do you want to respond to that? Because I'm going to go to some more questions, unless you'd like to respond.
Well, just as a maybe
Caroline
a slight
Frederickson.
corrective is that I think one of the things we don't often connect are the gerrymandering and then what legislatures do afterwards. And I think what we saw in several of the states that Chris was talking about was that the states, through the redistricting process, targeted just a small number of districts and flipped the state house, and then immediately moved to put more restrictive voting measures on the ballot. And then we see how that comes out in this election, where you may say that there were that many thousands of votes that people didn't turn out. We don't know that yet, whether they didn't turn out or whether they couldn't turn out. So I think that's just a question that remains to be explored. But I think the fact of the matter is we all know that in our gut that when people are only talking to people that agree with them, which is what happens in these races now because the districts have been created so that there's only one group of people to talk to, There's only one kind of candidate. Now, that means that, so you're talking about the 6 in 10 voters who wouldn't switch. I want to talk about the 4 in 10. There's still 4 in 10, even under your data. There are people that are open. Those are people who want to be talked to by people who are going to be reaching compromise, who are going to be trying to find legislative solutions. And I think that's exactly where this takes us.
Can I respond?
Yes, please do.
It wasn't my data. Pew says that 6 in 10, those people are gone. It doesn't mean the 4 out of 10 are. The New York Times Rebecca Berg's article it determined that half of the self-identified swing voters aren't swing voters. So we're so far from having 40% available. Look at your next poll and say, who are the swing self-identified ticket splitters, swing voters, and divide that in half. That's your number. That's what's available.
I want to remind you that we are in the question and answer section of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan, your moderator. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, arguing it out over this motion: gerrymandering is destroying the political center. Nolan McCarty, did you want to get in on that? Okay, I can move on to another question. I wasn't sure if...
You can move on.
Okay, let's another question. Right in the center there, sir. The gentleman nearer to me. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. My name is Jin. I'm a resident of DC. Just curious about perception. If people believe that gerrymandering by the opposite party is causing polarization and they therefore become polarized due to that belief. So even conceding that maybe gerrymandering doesn't have any practical effect, people believe that it causes polarization and becomes so, doesn't that add to the polarization and therefore the destroying of the middle?
Let me let Caroline,
Thank
or
you.
actually, we haven't heard from you, David, in a while. Is the story of gerrymandering itself causing polarization? Is the narrative about the process of gerrymandering resulting, I think you're saying, in people being disaffected and causing polarization?
It could be. I don't have any data on that, or any sense that that's the case. I mean, I think that there is more awareness of this issue because I think it's happening at every level of our democracy. It's happened not only at the congressional level, but it's happened at the state level in very, very deep and dramatic ways. So there are, plenty of folks in North Carolina where in many years more voters come out for the Democrats, but they live under veto-proof majorities for Republicans in their House and their Senate.
And I think, Caroline, you wanted to join?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think it plays into a narrative that's pretty pervasive about how dysfunctional Congress is, how dysfunctional politicians are. They become completely unresponsive under this, under the sort of perception of gerrymandering. They're not accountable to us anymore, and that means that people then stop participating, which means that they're even less accountable. So I think the perception and the reality are definitely self-reinforcing.
Nolan McCarty, do you want to respond on that as well?
I don't think there's any data on the question. They've studied voter responses to various electoral laws, such as campaign finance laws, other laws. They find almost no correlation between how strict a state's or how liberal a state's campaign finance law is and the way the voters feel about the system. So I would assume it would be the same about gerrymandering.
And I'm not asking this sarcastically. You're a data guy. So
I am a data guy.
Narrative-y arguments don't carry weight with you very much?
I think narratives are nice. They help us to build intuitions about what might be going on. But at the end of the day, on a question like polarization, which is a description of how millions and millions of voters are behaving and how hundreds and hundreds of legislators throughout the United States are behaving, I think the numbers are really important.
Well, I have this to say. This concludes round 2 of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate, where our motion is gerrymandering is destroying the political center. And now we move on to round 3. I want to remind you that right after round 3, you're going to vote a second time, and I want to remind you that the way we determine victory is the difference in percentage points between the first and the second votes. Whoever's numbers go up the most. Round 3, closing arguments over this motion, gerrymandering is destroying the political center. These statements will be brief. They will be 2 minutes each. And first, to make her statement in support of the motion to get you to vote yes, Caroline Frederickson, President of the American Constitution Society.
Thank you. Well, I want to tell a little story because I actually think narratives are really important in politics. I want to tell you about Dale Schultz, who's a former Republican state representative in Wisconsin. He served 30 years. He's the plaintiff in one of the cases that's moving forward that's challenging partisan gerrymandering as a violation of the Constitution. He served in both the House and Senate of the Wisconsin State House. He was Senate Majority Leader. He retired in 2014 because the environment had become so partisan in Wisconsin. And he may be a Republican, but he was critical about how the State House had become so extreme, so full of gridlock, with no role for moderates. And when the 2011 districts were drawn, his district was drawn to be way too conservative for a moderate like him. So in 2014, he led the effort for nonpartisan redistricting in Wisconsin, but the Republican legislature wouldn't even have hearings. I just want to leave you with his quote. He says, "It's just sad when a political party has so lost faith in its ideas that it's pouring all of its energy into election mechanics. We should be pitching as political parties our ideas for improving things in the future, rather than mucking around in the mechanics and making it more confrontational at the voting sites and trying to suppress the vote." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline Frederickson. The motion again, gerrymandering is destroying the political center, and here to make his closing statement against the motion, Nolan McCarty. He is professor and chair of the Department of Politics at Princeton University.
Thanks. A lot of this has been made of the lack of competitiveness in House elections throughout this debate. So the question is it true? And my answer is yes, with a lot of very large buts. First but is that from 2006 to 2010, the House of Representatives suffered the largest three-party swing since the 1930s. So gerrymandering and polarization have been going on for a long time. In recent memory, we have as much turnover over 3 elections as we've seen since the 1930s. We have measures of competitiveness. How competitive are the districts? They tend to not change very much after reapportionment, but they change a lot mid-decade. There are long trends in competitiveness. They have almost nothing to do with reapportionment. The reason why there's so little competition in House elections has to do with 2 major realignments that this country has witnessed over the past 30 years. The first, and the best known, is the Southern realignment, where we went from a situation in which there was monopoly control of the South by the Democratic Party, and it transitioned to a competitive system where Democrats and Republicans were competitive, and finalized into a situation where the Democratic Party is not very competitive in House elections that are not minority districts. A second realignment is in the Northeast. The Northeast went from a uniformly Republican region, for the most part, transitioned to a competitive region where Democrats and Republicans competed, and has become a Democratic stronghold. None of that had to do realignment. Those are broad trends. And finally, let me make one last point. I think one of the things we learned last Tuesday really reinforces my point. As we all know, Donald Trump lost the popular vote, which appears to now be by 1% or 1.5%, yet won the Electoral College in a pretty substantial way. That's exactly the phenomenon that the proponents have been complaining about, that the Republicans are getting more seats than votes. That has nothing to do with gerrymandering. That's just where the American people are and where they live.
Thank you, Nolan McCarty. The motion again, gerrymandering is destroying the political center, and here to summarize his position in support of the motion, David Daley, author of Ratf KED, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. Here's David Daley.
Thank you so much for being here tonight and listening to us. We do have data on what's happened since 2010. We know that the middle has lost 99% of its representation in Congress over these last 20 years. We know that this does not happen by accident or because we have self-sorted ourselves. We have the data from Harvard showing the largest lurch since 2010 in one direction. We have political scientists who often doubt the role of the gerrymander in this, who study the maps that came out in 2010 and call it things like extreme statistical outlier, the most biased I have ever seen, a 1 in 1,000 shot of actually not having partisan intent. We know what has happened both from data and from living through it. I do want to return for a moment to Mark Meadows in North Carolina, because that is what happens on a concrete, specific level when you redistrict a state and you turn a conservative Democrat into a Tea Party Republican. Meadows represents a district that is 75% white, the average is 63. 9% Latino, the average 17. These are the numbers of these districts that the far right that has stopped so much in Congress over the last 6 years represent. They've drawn them for themselves. This is not about partisanship, this is about democracy. Our elections are not games. Our principles are too important to be subject to every 10 years arms wars over district lines that make our politics more nasty, more negative, way more expensive. We are the only democracy that allows this to happen. We've seen the ferocity with which partisans will fight to keep it. Nothing will change until we take it back. I ask for your support of this motion as a first step. Thank you.
Thank you, David Daley. And that motion, one more time, gerrymandering is destroying the political center. And here to summarize his position against the motion, Chris Jankowski, former executive director of the Red Map Project.
Thank you. I wasn't going to bring it up, but Caroline brought up Senator Schultz in Wisconsin. Let's talk about that. Senator Schultz is what we would call in our party a known moderate now. And he was not happy with the results of the elections in 2010, where his party actually took control, and there were more conservative members in his party that had the leadership and the control. He did not support Governor Walker's budget reform, public union reform, did not support any of that. But we had a 2 vote, and Red Map picked up a 2-seat majority, not just a 1 in Wisconsin Senate. So we were able to get all that through. What people don't realize is because Scott Walker did win his recall, we actually lost control of the state Senate in those recalls. The first wave in August of 2011, we won. We held on to 1 seat. We lost a seat. We held on the other seat by 471 votes after $30 million was spent on those state Senate elections. There were a few seats up under Governor Walker the following June, all of this under the old lines. And we actually lost control of the chamber by 1 vote, but by then there was going to be the new lines had already been passed and they would go into effect, so they picked it back up in November. Those lines that were in place through the recalls, though, were passed by Republicans in 2000. Democrats took complete control under them. They lost it back and forth. So I'm not sure that Senator Schultz had a lot to complain about the gerrymandering in Wisconsin. But I would also say that the state of Wisconsin was galvanized. You were either for Governor Walker or against, and there was no undecided vote. And that had nothing to do with gerrymandering. It just didn't. So I just want to take a quick minute. How many people know somebody, friend, colleague?
I just want to let you know you have 12 seconds left.
Who, no matter what you tell them about the last election, they were going to stick with their candidate. One person in your life. One person. I would say almost the whole room knows one. Real quick, how many people know 2 people in their life? All right. That's my point, folks.
Time is up. Polarized. Thank you, Chris Jankowski. And that concludes round 3 of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate, where our motion is gerrymandering is destroying the political center. And now it's time to learn which side you feel has argued the best. I want to ask you again to go to the keypads at your seat. The vote is the same as at the beginning, except now you've heard the arguments. The motion, gerrymandering is destroying the political center. If you agree with the motion, if you want to vote yes, vote with this side, push number 1. If you disagree with the motion, you're voting no, you're voting with this side, push number 2. If you became or remain undecided, push number 3. And just as before, we'll lock out the vote in about 15 seconds, and then we'll have the result in about a minute. No more like a minute and a half. Okay, looks like from eye contact again, everybody's back with me. So one thing I want to say is, I said at the beginning we wanted to dedicate this to Gwen Eiffel, who was the PBS NewsHour anchor, who passed away today because of how deeply she represented civility and truth, a search for the facts. I want to congratulate this panel for living up to that. This is, as we all know, it's a very tense time. there have been some bad feelings. I felt on this stage what we saw was a demonstration of civility, respect for one another, and search on both sides for the truth. So I want to congratulate our debaters for the way that you did this. And I want to thank Jeffrey Rosen and the National Constitution Center for partnering with us. You are a terrific partner. The National Constitution Center is an hour-and-a-half train ride from here. It is well worth a visit. I mean, it is really well worth a visit up in Philadelphia. Intelligence Squared US is a nonprofit organization. I know that you paid ticket prices to get in here, but ticket prices don't come close to covering what it costs us to do this program in the cities that we do it in. It's a philanthropy. Our podcasts, our radio broadcasts are sent out into the world for free. We are used now in hundreds of schools. So if you support what you heard here tonight, we would very much appreciate your going to our website, iq2us.org, and making a donation. It would mean a great deal to all of us. Our next debate, we're going to be in New York City on November 29th at the Kaufman Center. The motion we'll be looking at President Obama's foreign policy legacy. Our panel will include military historian and a former counselor at the Department of State, Elliot Cohen, and Derek Chollet, who is a former Undersecretary of Defense. He's author of a book called The Long Game, which is described as being the closest anyone will come to understanding the thinking behind Obama's foreign policy. On December 7th, we will be again partnering with the National Constitution Center. Our motion will be I don't have it phrased as a motion. I'm telling you what the topic is. It's going to be over whether or not we should be calling a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution, which in light of tonight's discussion gets even more juicy. Our debaters will include Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig and Mark Meckler, who is a grassroots. Tickets for that are still available through our website. And I do want to mention this, if you can't get to our debates, and we're delighted that everybody got here. We love coming to Washington and to GW for this reason, to see all of you here, but you can watch our debates and listen to them a wide variety of ways. Our newest addition is that we are now available as an app on Roku and on Apple TV. So if you have Roku or Apple TV, you can just search through there. We also have an app where you can watch and listen to debates on your phone through the Apple Store and through the Android Store. And for all of this, just to learn more about us completely, our website has everything going on there, iq2us.org. Thank you very much. Okay, I have the results now. You have voted twice. The motion is this: gerrymandering is destroying the political center. I want to remind you that it's the difference between the two votes that determines who our winner is. Let's look at the first vote. In the first vote, gerrymandering is destroying the political center. 62% of you agreed, 8% were against, 30% were undecided. The team arguing for the motion, let's look at their second vote. Their first vote was 53%, there's 62%. Their second vote was 53%. They lost 9 percentage points. Let's look at the team arguing against the motion. Their first vote was 8%. Their second vote was 34%. They picked up 26 percentage points. It means the team arguing against the motion, gerrymandering is destroying the political center, named our winners. Our congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US. We'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure. Thanks.